Everybody knows that Barry Allen disappeared in the original Crisis all the way back in 1985. The character's passing is so well known because it's one of the few deaths in comics that lasted longer than just a year or two, with Flash's death spanning 2 whole decades before Barry came back in 2007's Final Crisis. Now that's 22 years on the bench, which gives Barry's passing a lot more weight than, say, Batman's or Superman's. It was always intended for those characters to come back from death somehow.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And both of them did within about a year of their passing, as compared to Barry's 22 years in limbo. The character being gone so long, and the stories about Wally picking up his mantle, are a big part of why the character's passing was so impactful and so memorable. A lot more impactful than any other superhero's death I can think of. There's an entire generation of comic readers that grew up with an entirely different Flash because of this.
I have no idea who this is.
And the story of Wally's insecurity living in Barry's shadow plays out in nearly every run the character's in. From Morrison and Wade's time with Wally, to the character's time on Justice League Europe a few years later. There's a really nice arc in that book where Elastic Man and Wally have this kind of rivalry at first, and then they end up bonding over their lost comrade. It's a really sweet story, and it's a great example of what I'm talking about. Even though Barry was gone, his presence was felt in a really significant way through the stories about his death. He casts a shadow over Wally's stories in a way that kind of helped build up the character's legendary status over the years. Because Barry didn't just come back once. He came back several times. Death wasn't the end for Barry Allen. In a lot of ways, it was a new beginning, and it's not like the character ever really died anyway. No one ever really stays dead in comics, not unless you're Uncle Ben or Batman's parents. He didn't die, he was just teleported by the Speedforce somewhere else, to a place outside the space and hypertime of the Divine Continuum. A place like the Marvel Universe. Here's what happened. 5 years after 1985's Crisis Number 8, in 1990's Quasar 17, an Elder of the Universe named the Runner gathers all the Marvel speedsters and challenges them to a race. After the race starts, Barry just kind of appears out of nowhere in a flash of lightning. He has a full beard, his costume is half ripped off, and he's completely amnesiac. He doesn't remember a thing.
I'm in a fugue right now.
Barry has no clue who he is or how he got there. All he knows is one thing.
Speed. I am Speed.
All Flash knows to do is run, and so he does. Barry outpaces every speedster in the Marvel Universe and wins the race by a long shot. The Runner offers Barry any prize he could ask for. Then Barry asks to go home, to which the Runner replies, "Speed is your home," then disappears with him in the blink of an eye. So if you don't know, the Elders of the Universe are characters like the Collector in Guardians of the Galaxy, or Grandmaster in Thor Ragnarok. So Flash being taken away as a pet by one of those guys is just a little sussy if you ask me, Baka. But what happens after that? Well, the Runner and Buried Alien wouldn't appear again for 4 years, with both characters showing up in 1994's Quasar 58, where there's yet another race. And yet again, Barry Allen, now going by the name Fast Forward, is a competitor. So Barry still has amnesia at this point, but at least he doesn't think his name is Buried Alien anymore. Barry ends up bowing out of the race early to go stop a bad guy, then catches up with Quasar and Makari at the end of the book. We find out Barry still has amnesia, but has flashing memories of his wife in original universe. The Eternal Makari promises to help Barry find his way home, and I guess he did because Makari didn't show up for like another 10 years after that. And Barry's next appearance would have him back in the DC universe. In issue 3 of The Sandman Presents, Thessalian, Barry only shows up for a few panels. He's still amnesiac, he still doesn't remember anything, but what is notable is that he's back in the DC universe, and he's in the DC universe version of Heaven, which means somehow, someway, Makari did fulfill his promise and help get Barry home. So the next time you watch Eternals, remember that this chick's 616 counterpart helped to get the Flash back home after Crisis. I'm just kidding. The next time you watch the Eternals, nobody gives a shit about the fucking Eternals.
You take that back, slut!
Barry Allen's next Postmortem appearance would be in Kevin Smith's Green Arrow 7 in 2001. During a trip through the Afterlife, Oliver Queen would encounter a number of deceased DC heroes. Characters like Deadman, Jason Todd, Hal Jordan, or the Spectre. Something I find really interesting here is that at some point between Sandman and Green Arrow, Barry got his memories back. Whatever happened off screen, but something happened. Which is funny because Barry even remembers the events of Crisis, but Ollie doesn't. Which, following Crisis logic, kind of makes sense, I guess. I think the idea is that most of the members of the DC universe don't remember the Crisis happening, but certain characters do whenever it happens to be convenient to the plot. I don't know. But I thought it was super sweet that Barry asks how Wally's doing. And of course, Ollie tells Barry that Wally's making him proud. Just a really sweet moment there. Another interesting revelation is that on top of the fact that Barry has all of his memories back now, the story also reveals that there are 2 Oliver Queens. One who died and stayed dead, and another mirror clone Tulpa version that Hal Jordan returned to life as a Spectre. So after Green Arrow died, when he got brought back, one version of Oliver stayed in heaven, and then a cloned version got sent back to Earth, but they both share the same soul. That might be relevant to Fast Forward and Buried Alien in the Marvel Universe, it might not. If you're familiar with Quentin Review's doppelganger theory, or the tulpas from Twin Peaks, maybe you can kind of draw a connection there, but it'd be way too much of a tangent to get into at this moment. Just know that doppelgangers, the metaverse, Fortnite looper clones, and tulpas are all definitive Hypercrisis territories, and we're gonna come back to them all one day in the future.
Also in the past.
Alright, so where were we?
You were mocking my Eternals and then went on a rant about the World Economic Forum and Project Blue Book again.
That's right. I was talking about The Flash and Judeo-Christian DC Comic Book 7. So let's get back at it. This one involves one of my all-time favorite comic book characters, Boston Brand, the Deadman. If you didn't know, Deadman's whole shtick is that he's a superhero ghost who possesses people. So Deadman, Dead Again, reveals that while Flash was ripping through time, sending messages to all of his loved ones, Deadman tried to possess him in order to understand what was going on, but then he got ripped out of Barry Allen's body somewhere in the middle of space and time. The story retcons Deadman into the original Crisis as a sort of unseen ally that we weren't privy to when we read the original. That kind of retcon in and of itself was a little bit of a trope. You see it with characters like the Sentry, Jessica Jones, or even Deadpool in Secret Wars, where they try to retcon modern characters into older stories, and they come up with some kind of clever, brainwashy time travel explanation as to why they were never mentioned in the original, or what happened off screen. Honestly, it's kind of a trope that I enjoy a lot, and I think it can be a lot of fun when you use it the right way. So after the Flash dies, Deadman was supposed to be the angel that escorts him to the afterlife. But that never happened because Barry's soul was stolen by one of Deadman's more dated enemies. So Caldera takes the Flash's soul back to Hell where he tries to steal his power. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Deadman finds himself post-Crisis in the middle of Jason Todd's death. He tries to stop it and fails, only for Caldera to show up and try and steal Robin's soul too. So Caldera is trying to use the souls of dead superheroes to make a deal with Neron. Deadman gets cued in by the Spectre, stops Caldera and Neron, and then helps set the dead heroes free so their souls can move on to the afterlife. I think you could headcanon this to take place in between Flash's trip to the Marvel Universe and Quasar, and then his reappearance in Heaven and Sandman. So Barry runs so fast in Crisis that he leaves the DC multiverse, enters the Omniverse, and then re-enters into the Marvel multiverse. Then after the events of Quasar, Mercari helps him go fast enough that he can re-exit the Marvel multiverse back into the Omniverse, and then re-enter his original DC universe at the exact moment he left it, basically making Flash's trip to the Marvel Universe a self-fulfilling time loop. That might be relevant later, it might not. Once again, bringing us back to the Marvel Universe. In the JLA Avengers crossover, there's an incursion between the DC and Marvel universes, warping reality to combine the Avengers and the Justice League into a coexisting timeline. A lot of the tragedy that the Avengers and the Justice League went through just didn't happen here. Barry never died in Crisis, Hal never became Parallax, Wanda and Vision never lost their kids, but those gains come at a cost. That cost being the legacy that they would have left behind. So that means characters like Kyle Rayner or Wally West either never become superheroes or don't exist at all. The heroes end up sacrificing their second chance at life in order to save the loved ones who'd been erased in the aftermath. So the combined might of the Avengers and the Justice League managed to turn the tide and save the day. Barry cracks one last joke and disappears, being replaced by Wally, as both timelines are restored. Now, you know how I said Deadman probably takes place after Quasar? Well, I think this takes place before it. So keep in mind Speedforce time travel shenanigans, which means that some things happened out of order. During Crisis, Barry runs so fast that he exits the DC multiverse in hypertime, and then enters the merged amalgamate universe from JLA Avengers. He helps fix things there, and then when the universes separate, because of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey, multiversal bullshit, Barry loses his memories, gets amnesia, and ends up getting thrown back in time to the events of Quasar 17. After that, Mercari helps Flash escape the Marvel Universe and run back to the events of Crisis Issue 8 like none of it ever happened. Barry ends up back in his original body with amnesia. He dies, meets Deadman, shows up in Sandman, still has amnesia, gets his memories back off screen, then helps out Dead Ollie and Hal in Heaven. And Barry most assuredly hasn't left behind any tulpas or variant berries that could have been orphaned from destroyed timelines, right?
It don't matter. None of this matters.
Okay, so we're almost caught up to Barry's resurrection in 2007. So here's what happened next. So Barry has 2 more appearances before he finally comes back for good. He has a cameo in Infinite Crisis where he pops up alongside another few dead speedsters. And then he finally comes back for good in Final Crisis.
Wait. If the last time we saw Barry was in heaven, then how did he go from heaven into the Speedforce? That means he didn't vanish into the Speedforce in the original Crisis. That means he just died, right?
Wrong!
Well, the answers that the Speedforce has its own version of heaven, or something like that. And then the more complicated extension of that answer is that all the different heavens in the DC universe and the DC multiverse really are all kind of connected, because all the gods you see, like Darkseid or Mr. Miracle, they aren't the actual new gods, they're more like extensions or avatars of the new gods. But again, that's a topic for another day. There's another angle that I think makes this really interesting, and another connection that I don't think anyone's ever drawn yet, and it all relates to one thing: Hal Jordan's time as the Spectre. So here we go one last time. Second verse, same as the first. Flash disappears in Crisis 1985. He ran so fast that he accidentally exited the DC multiverse and entered a tangent universe that exists outside the DC and Marvel multiverse, but also exists adjacent to them, like Fortnite.
A tangent universe? You mean like Donnie Darko?
That's right, like Donnie Darko. I knew that phase in high school wasn't for nothing. So in the fallout of the JLA Avengers crossover, Barry's Flash helps Hal Jordan's Spectre separate the two universes. At some point while he was in heaven, off-panel, in between stories, before Green Arrow Quiver, Barry got his memories back, where we see Barry interacting with Hal Jordan as the Spectre again. That's significant. So after Hal Jordan died, in order to atone for his sins, he was turned into the Spectre. The Spectre is God's spirit of vengeance, so basically DC's version of Ghost Rider, but on a more grand, epic, cosmic scale. So how did Barry go from being in heaven to being trapped in the Speedforce during both Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis? The answer seems obvious. See, while Hal was the Spectre, he kind of had a tendency to abuse his godly powers. I brought up one of the ways he did that earlier, when he split the soul of Green Arrow into two parts, so one could return to Earth and then the other one could stay in heaven. So if Hal brought back one of his dead best friends, he probably brought back the other one too. Second verse, same as the first. My thought is that Barry exited heaven through the Speedforce, not by his own will, but probably because Hal Jordan as the Spectre pushed Barry into it. So my theory, my interpretation that makes everything make sense, is that Hal Jordan pushed Barry Allen out of heaven and into the Speedforce, which also has its own version of heaven, which probably connects the Speedforce to heaven somehow, someway, because comics. And in DC Comics, all the different versions of heaven are all sort of connected. It's hard to explain, and I'm not really gonna bother. That's a story for another day, probably for a Sandman video, but that's my theory. It's never really stated in the text of the continuity, but that's my best guess at what happens in between stories to kind of tie them all together and make it make sense. Now obviously, none of this was ever really the author's intent. I don't think any of the writers of any of these stories ever intended for them to connect like this. I think they were all just kind of trying to do their own thing. But if that's the case, then why do they all fit together so well? I've got two answers: Hypercrisis and Death of the Author. Next chapter. But first, we need to talk about Mantis. That's right, Guardians of the Galaxy Mantis. Mantis first appeared in Avengers 112 by Steve Englehart, and from that point onward, Steve would carry the character with him everywhere he went, even outside of Marvel Comics. Steve would write the character for Marvel, for DC, for Eclipse Comics. She even shows up in his book The Long Man. And he did all this without Marvel's permission or knowledge. And one of the most interesting things about all this is that even though he didn't have Marvel's permission to do any of it, Marvel still considers all that material to be canon to their universe and their version of Mantis. So in her first appearance, Mantis is introduced as a Vietnamese prostitute who's dating a supervillain. The two join the Avengers almost immediately. Mantis was also raised by aliens to be the Celestial Madonna. What does that mean? It means she's supposed to give birth to Cosmic Jesus. Englehart was in love with Mantis, and he kind of shoehorned into the middle of every single Avengers book. It eventually got to the point where almost the entire book was rotating around Mantis. That was something that fans didn't really appreciate, and neither did Marvel editorial. Eventually, Mantis' supervillain boyfriend would die, and she would abandon her body and assume a new astral form in order to ascend into space with his ghost. She doesn't die necessarily, but that new astral form is kind of like a cocoon for her. Steve Englehart had a falling out with Marvel around 1976, and left the company altogether soon after. Her next appearance would be in Superman over at DC Comics, and I'm just gonna pull a clip from ComicDrake's video for this one, because he explains it way better than I could.
Avengers Celestial Quest. This book sucks too. It is once again another comic that revolves around Mantis. And we found out that when she exploded in the 80s Silver Surfer comic, she had actually shattered into multiple phantom forms that faded from memory as soon as she left. This was basically an explanation as to how she could appear in every single book that Steve was writing at the time, sometimes at the same time, and why nobody remembers her or references her. It's not because she was an insufferable character that nobody liked or wanted to write. It's because She was actually 5 ghosts.
If you're still curious about Mantis after you finish this video, be sure to check that one out. So there you go. Just like Barry Allen was a Marvel character for about 4 years, Mantis was a DC character and an Eclipse character for about 7. Even though Englehart didn't have Marvel's permission and used their character at another publisher without their consent or knowledge, Marvel still considered the books from other publishers to be canon to their version of Mantis. Like if you look at the living room here, it's the same living room from the Eclipse comic. So if Marvel considers the DC and Eclipse appearances of Mantis to be canon to their version of the character, then I don't see why Barry Allen's Marvel appearances wouldn't be canon too. And to break this down to what I really want you to get out of this, how do you split the difference between authorial intent, editorial mandates, the company's intention, and a contradicting history of canon that goes back hundreds of writers and multiple decades? An author's intention can be subverted and contradicted a lot easier in the world of comics, just because there are more cooks in the kitchen. Books that were never intended to be canon could become canon just by virtue of being popular, like what happened with Killing Joke. Killing Joke was supposed to be an Elseworld story because of its ending. The ending of the book was supposed to be vague, but have the implication that Batman might have strangled the Joker. But then after the book was published, we would end up seeing Barbara Gordon in a wheelchair in Suicide Squad. And of course, Joker would keep showing up in Batman for years on end. All that stuff subverts and contradicts Alan Moore's original intention. You're not supposed to know what happened at the end of the book, but because they made the book canon, now we know, and it kind of ruins the twist at the end. It ruins the ambiguity. It's like if someone made a sequel to Inception. One of the first things they would have to do is break the ambiguity of the first movie's ending. Alan Moore's authorial intent is contradicted and devalued by the presence of canon. Which brings us to the main point of the video. Death of the author in relation to the world of comic books, and the idea that authorial intent dies faster in the world of comic books.
I can no more tell you what happens to her than I can tell you what becomes of Proust's narrator, or Holden Caulfield's sister, or Huckleberry Finn after he lights out for the territories. What happens after the book ends is nothing, he insists. The book is fiction. It didn't happen. It's not real.
It doesn't matter, right? You must understand that these people aren't real, okay? They don't live in the real world. And adults cannot tell the difference between fantasy and reality. But you bring them fantasy, and the first thing they say is, how did he get that way? Why does he dress like that? How did that happen? It's not real.
Bullshit. That's bullshit. Just tell me. Make something up. Hazel has tied the idea that there is life for these characters after the book ends with her own narrative. She needs to believe that there is a life for these characters beyond the text, because she sees so much of herself in the text. As a solitary text unto itself, The Fault in Our Stars could be read as an argument in favor of Death of the Author. The author has no answers for them. Seeking out his authorial intent is an exercise in futility. The author has emotionally moved on from the book, and if he does have an answer to Hazel's question, he is not obligated to share it. But moreover, his intent does not matter. This seems to be the theme of The Fault in Our Stars, that a part of growing up is to stop looking to other people, especially authors, to explain the meaning behind texts, but instead to figure out what your own reading is.
In the world of comics, there are just so many cooks in the kitchen. Editors, artists, future writers, the publisher, the parent company, all with differing intentions. And with characters like Batman or Superman, you have an unending continuous narrative that might go on forever, with forever including reboots, retcons, soft resets, and more cooks in the kitchen. And what that means is that the death of the author comes sooner than later in the world of comic books. A lot sooner than the world of film or the world of music. But what is death of the author?
The simplest reduction of the essay's thesis is that readers should pull away from the tenet of traditional literary criticism that focused on authorial intent, and instead adopt a more text-oriented approach that focused on the interaction between the reader and the text, not between reader and the author. Take, for example, William Shakespeare's Macbeth. Traditional readings of the text would argue that an understanding of both Scottish history and Shakespeare's life are fundamental in understanding the play itself, and how it reflects the king's relationship to the author. King James was also the patron of Shakespeare's acting company at the time. But for Bart, none of this background information would be pertinent in reading Macbeth. Meaning, to Bart, lies in the language of a text itself, and whatever impressions the reader creates from it. The author is less of a god and more of a mere scripter.
Word of God is the ultimate symbol of authorial intent, and whereas a film director might maintain Word of God over their works for decades, maybe even changing or altering new cuts of old movies like George Lucas or Ridley Scott, a comic book writer doesn't even have full control of the narrative intent when they create it, let alone years later. At least speaking in broad strokes when we're talking about characters like Spider-Man, Batman, or Flash. For characters like Invincible or Radiant Black, this doesn't really apply. So my theory is that Word of God and authorial intent matter less less in the world of comic books than maybe any other art form in existence. And to tie it all back to Flash, when Marv Wolfman wrote the original Crisis, there's no way he could have known that all those future writers would try to bring Barry back. All these different writers wrote all these stories independently with no real intent for them to tie together like this at all. All these stories actually kind of contradict each other in a lot of places. It takes a lot of jumping through hoops to make them all fit together the way I did. But again, that's just the nature of comic books. I think the silly, complicated, convoluted stuff is part of the fun to me. But I also think it's why canon ultimately doesn't matter at all. What matters more than canon is intent and interpretation.
Today I want to talk about intent. There was a whole thing about death of the author, what death of the author is. I don't own Fallout. I never did. I didn't own it back then. It was a work for hire creation as an employee of Interplay. They owned it. I don't even see myself as canon, especially now. I don't have anything to do with Bethesda. When I say something about Fallout, you cannot say it's canon. Lots of people do. I don't control what they do. All I can tell you is, in the 90s when Fallout was being made, this was the intent. If it's gone off in a different direction, great. If you interpret it as something different, great. But I will tell you what the intent was, and that is what it was. Of course you can interpret it any way you want. And your interpretations aren't necessarily wrong, although they will differ with other people's. But you can't tell me what the intent was. I was there. I know what we were trying to do. People tried to tell me what my intent was, or even that my intent, I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. I can tell you what my intent was, and you can tell me that isn't how you interpreted it. And that's about it.
So there's this phenomena in modern nerd media, in Cape Shit and Transformers and He-Man, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, everywhere, where fans get upset when lore is altered or changed by an adaptation.
I'm sorry, but that's not my Batman.
But then they also get upset again when it's changed back. People hated the Black Spider-Man costume originally, but then they loved it after it was gone. People hated Flash's Venom at first, and then they loved him when he was gone. People hated a ton of the elements and lore that Donny Cates added to Venom as well. But now Noel's about to show up in a movie just because of how popular he is. So when fans are making fan theories or having water cooler Discord conversations about comics, by the way, join the Swim Reads Comics Discord. When we're making theories as fans, we're going by fan wiki rulebooks and adhering to lore pretty strictly. But a writer doesn't have to do that. They can add new stuff to the lore, they can change things, subvert them. They have the power to get more abstract with it than fans do. Think about Infinity War to Endgame. Marvel didn't let fans know anything about the movie. There was no way to know they do a 5-year time skip or a time travel story, or that they destroy the stones and kill Thanos in the first 5 minutes of the movie. But still, going by the comic and rumors of a time travel heist movie, fans kind of assumed that the movie would end with a reset back to the moment the snap happened, and that characters like Vision would just return clean in the blink of an eye. But the second you see Tony's daughter, any fan theory about going back in time and resetting things goes out the door. The goalposts were shifted in a way that automatically invalidated about 80% of the fan theories out there, and I think that's super clever writing. And it just goes to show that the way writers write and the way that fan theorists predict are two completely different games.
It's giving checkers versus chess.
He's out of line, but he's right.
A writer can move a goalpost in a way that fan theories just can't predict. And that's always going to frustrate fan theorists when it comes to fan theories that they put a lot of passion and a lot of work and a lot of heart into and just got way too hyped up on and honestly probably put too much thought into. And they consider stuff like the 90s Star Wars remasters, where George Lucas added in new scenes or even changed and altered existing scenes, leading to a hallmark debate in nerd culture. Was it Greedo or Han Solo that shot first? There's a scene that was altered so that Greedo shot first instead of Han Solo, which makes Han seem like more of a good guy and less morally ambiguous on account of the fact that he shot in self-defense instead of shooting to just be an asshole or show dominance or some shit, I guess. But regardless, it makes his turn to the side of good less impactful because he's less of a bad guy in the beginning. So what that means is that sometimes you have multiple conflicting sources of authorial intent within one author's lifetime. So if that's the case, then which one counts? The original authorial intent or the revisionist one later? Who shot first, Han or Greedo? Let me know in the comments down below. This comes up a lot in Harry Potter and Star Wars. And don't get me started on how many cuts of Blade Runner there are, or even stuff like modernized recolors in comics. So with all these cooks in the kitchen, and all these alternate cuts of the original media, it makes it even harder for us to figure out the author's intent, as if that was ever even possible at all in the first place. But again, in the world of comics, this is just another Tuesday. New ideas get introduced, subverted, changed, and contradicted, and then changed back to the original intention, sometimes all within the same year. You have all this stuff like Jeff Johns establishing that there are 3 Jokers back during his Justice League run, then fans didn't really like his 3 Jokers book, so there's a chance that Chip Zdarsky might already be working on rolling back the 3 Jokers thing, happening, so ideas get introduced, and then when they don't work out or if fans don't like them enough, they get changed or altered or subverted. And while all of that contradicting stuff is part of the fun to me, it tends to really annoy the more hardcore fans.
This is not uncommon, it's literally just gatekeeping. There will always be people in fandom spaces who align themselves as closely as possible to the origin of the fandom, and they consider themselves to be superior because of it. A lot of times, those same people will get caught on semantics of, well, I'm right though. It is technically this XYZ thing. Those arguments are predicated on the idea that nothing ever evolves and changes, and fandom culture constantly evolves and changes. You find yourself as someone who is stuck on this stuff and are like, no, but it is correct, isn't it? I want you to ask yourself this. Is this something that is objectively important, or is it important to you because it has value to you? It can have value to you, and that's totally fine. My personal recommendation is that people like this always exist in almost every fandom space, and they are best ignored.
So personally, I don't read things in the interpretation of the author, in the interpretation of continuity, or the fan community. I've always just kind of tried to build my own interpretation, my own sense of canon. And then through fan theories, Twitter, and YouTube, I try to share that interpretation with the rest of the world.
A super commercial TV show shouldn't be able to break that law for you. You do not have to count it. I really love a certain part of Star Wars. I really hate a certain other part of Star Wars. I have just chosen to pick and choose which Star Wars that I like. The other parts don't exist in my canon, and that's fine. There's nothing anybody can do to stop me from feeling that way. It's a way that I enjoy. I'm much happier that way. That is what I would implore you to do with this kind of show. They are definitely not actively trying to disrespect you by deviating from any source material, intentional or otherwise. It's basically my stance, especially like where Halo is concerned. That TV show doesn't even exist. It's just not real at all. Never came out. Does not exist.
Which is sort of the goal of what I'm doing here in these videos, sharing my reinterpretation and reiteration of these stories, connecting them in ways that they weren't connected before, and then also creating and crafting theories that I hope you, the audience, can help me expand, build on, and grow. Which brings me to the greatest theory of all, the Hypercrisis Theory. It's all about sewing back together the threads of continuity after canonical dissonance breaks them. It's about making connections out of contradictions. Where one person sees a plot hole, I see an unexplained, unexplored story. So what I'm doing here is taking all these opposing, alternative narratives about Flash's postmortem shenanigans, and I'm trying to reconnect them and reinterpret them in a way that kind of ties them all together and works. I'm giving you a recommended reading list, but then I'm also subtly rewriting my own narrative into the fiction as well through this video. That's the way it works in comic writing, that's the way it works on my channel.
That's how Dad did it, that's how America does it, and it's worked out pretty well so far.
I read all things in the greater context of the third Hypercrisis, in the context of the idea that everything is a part of one greater universal narrative, and that narrative is always changing. So the theory, the Hypercrisis, is also always changing. The Dalai Lama once said something like, if science proves Buddhism wrong, then Buddhism will have to change. So if the next crisis over at DC, or if the MCU Secret Wars prove the Hypercrisis theory wrong, then the Hypercrisis will have to change. So when it comes to interpretation and reiteration, just think about how many different versions of the Bible there are. There's the King James Version, the English Standard Version, the Old Testament of the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran are all based off of the same book. They all have the same point of origin. All three religious texts of all three different religions have the same stories, like Noah or Gilgamesh, or even David and Goliath. They're all based off of the same thing. But do you know what that is? That's death of the author. That's reinterpretation, retelling, rebooting, and retconning continuity. Do you know the point of origin for the word canon? It comes from Catholicism. That's right, that makes the crucifixion of Christ a canon event. And did you know that there were secret books that were taken out of the Bible by the Vatican? So that means that the Bible has retcons and hidden lore. Canon is a religious concept. Literally, it is a religious concept that was reworked by nerds to apply to Star Wars and comic books. And I fucking love it because the implications of that are wild. You know what that means? It means my ship's valid. It means your ship's valid. It means that if you apply Authorial Intent and Word of God, then Justin Roiland confirmed that the creepiest person you know's ship is valid. Every ship imaginable is canon somewhere out there in the multiverse. None of it matters. All of it matters. It all counts and it's always changing. So let's take these ideas. Let's reapply Death of the Author to comic books and call it Death of the Canon. Because I think that's the best way you can read comic books. Build your own headcanon. Build your own interpretation. It doesn't have to all make sense. It doesn't matter if Two-Face has one origin in Dark Victory, then a different origin in Robin Year One, then they come out with Batman and Robin Year One that contradicts that and Batgirl years later. It doesn't matter if Robin is introduced in Year 3 or Year 4. You just have to split the difference in your head, develop your own headcanon, and write off any of the inconsistencies as something like Booster Gold or Flash going back in time and Butterfly Effect changing something. You have to learn to split the difference between contradicting takes and then build your own. You can explain away any inconsistency as being the result of time travel or universe incursions or reboots and resets. It doesn't matter. What I'm trying to say here is don't let the pedantic will it canon or not debates get you down. Seek out the answer that's in your heart, for you know it to be true. And don't forget to read more comic books. I'd like to give a huge thank you to my channel members and patrons. If you want to learn more about the Hypercrisis theory, there should be a playlist of all my Hypercrisis videos on screen now. And if you want to help expand the Hypercrisis narrative, then drop your thoughts in the comments down below. And be sure to like and subscribe as well. And with all that being said, I've been Swim, and I'll see you in the next one.